Hello everyone, and welcome to your complete and ultimate Wanderer guide. Wanderer is one of the few characters I have built on both of my accounts, and in lieu of his current rerun, this video is to hopefully guide any current or future Wanderer owners on how to roughly build and play him. This video will cover all of the following in order: general playstyle, talent overview, weapon options, artifact sets and stats, team comps, Constellation Overview, and an Abyss 12 showcase, all in an as condensed manner as possible. I'll be showing two different Wanderers throughout this video, with my free-to-play account Wanderer having his signature weapon at Refinement 2, but only has a C3 Farazan, while my main account's Wanderer does not have his signature weapon, but does have a C6 Farazan. This will hopefully be a better demonstration for those wondering about his performance in different teams and builds. With all of that out of the way, let's get right into the guide. Wanderer is a DPS who focuses on being an on-field damage dealer. Due to him being Animo, he's relatively flexible in his team comps, but typically has a focus on being a Hypercarry when paired with Farazan. However, he can work as a driver in numerous reaction-based teams. I commonly play him in Hyperbloom and National Comms on my free-to-play account, since Animo is a flexible element that mostly won't affect other reactions. As an on-field DPS, Wanderer relies mainly on either his normal or charge attacks depending on the situation. He is usually considered a single target focused character due to his normal attacks not being very AoE focused. This makes him especially good against bosses and differentiates him from the other primary Animo DPS in the game, Xiao. Where Xiao has a focus on AoE damage, Wanderer is generally better in single target scenarios and also much easier to play thanks to his long range and autopilot playstyle. But he does have several drawbacks in both his quality of life gameplay and energy issues, which I'll get to later. While he is single target in nature, charge attacks and to a much lesser extent his normal attacks do have some AoE, which means if you have at least some form of crowd control in the party, such as a C6 Farazan or another Animo support like Venti or Kazuha who can clump up enemies for Wanderer to hit them, he is still okay in multi-target scenarios. Also, Wanderer is the only character in the game who can literally fly. This makes him one of the best overall exploration characters in the game, and does also provide some offensive utility, which we'll get to later. All in all though, Wanderer is a simple character, being a main DPS archetype. Him being Animo makes him more flexible than other Hypercarry type DPSs, and his damage does scale well with both his team and vertical investment. He's a very straightforward left-click gaming character that's simple and flexible, albeit somewhat frustrating to play at times. Starting with Wanderer's normal attack talent. This is Wanderer's most used part of his kit, despite its simplicity. Wanderer has a 3-hit normal attack string that has good damage multipliers and are homing due to him being a catalyst character. This is normally used alongside his skill when he is in the air due to the increased damage. A common misconception is that his normal attacks are not good in AoE scenarios. While this is somewhat true, the AoE of his normal attacks is bigger than the animation might imply. If the enemies are large or at the very least are decently close together, Wanderer can still very reliably hit multiple targets as well. So in certain situations, he is still very much competitive in slight crowds of enemies. His charge attack, unlike his normal attack, deals AoE damage and has the ability to stagger and lift small enemies into the air. Similar to his normal attacks, the damage multiplier of this is quite good, and in certain situations is more favorable to do. Without his skill, each charge attack will consume a standard 50 stamina just like most catalyst characters. His normal attack has standard ICD, while his charge attack has no ICD, which might make this useful in certain teams that can allow for swirl reactions to be impactful. So when should you use his normal and when should you use his charge attacks? Well, it heavily depends. First off, if you're facing single target situations, then it will vary on your weapon and artifact set. If you have the Too Late to Less Remembrance, use the Desert Pavilion Chronicle artifact set, have a normal attack speed buffing character like Ji-Eun, or all three, then you should definitely just stick to normal attacks. With DPC though, make sure you open with at least one charge attack first for the set bonus buff. If you don't have Too Late to Less or don't use DPC, then spamming charge attacks can be optimal and is also preferred in AoE scenarios. The biggest problem with this is that you will need to make sure you get at least 14 charge attacks, which does require, not exactly precise, but at least decent timing to be consistent with. This will also be easier if you infuse Hydro with his skill though, which will increase his flight time and thus allow you to weave in more charge attacks. Normally, I stick to just N3 spamming since it's easier and I also have Wanderer's signature weapon at Refinement 2, but for those without those previously mentioned, then charge attack spamming can be more favorable. I'd say the difference is small enough where you shouldn't have to think too hard about it and just play whichever is more comfortable for you. but in AoE scenarios, it is more incentivizing to use his charge attacks. Either way, this talent is what affects Wanderer's DPS the most and thus should be the highest priority to level. Wanderer's elemental skill when cast deals AoE animal damage and sends him flying into the air. While in the air, his normal and charge attacks will deal increased damage and he will gain a new stamina bar that will gradually go down as he remains flying in the air. While flying, his dash and jump will also be converted into air dashes and rising higher into the air respectively, both consuming a set amount of his flight stamina. For his air dash, he does retain iframes just like a regular dash, so you can still use it to avoid enemy attacks. You can also hold your dash to fly very quickly, albeit for not very long. You can also do the same thing with ascending his flight height by holding spacebar, and the most effective way to increase his height is to hold it right till you have very little stamina left, then tap it again so that you can get one last boost of height. This is mainly useful in the overworld to preserve some stamina for climbing. The height increase is also useful against certain enemies. In the current 3.8 Abyss, as well as back in 3.4's Abyss, there were chambers that were predominantly occupied by Rift Wolves. As Rift Wolves apply corrosion and have a lot of unpredictable attacks, Wanderer can actually avoid all hits by ascending one time into the air after casting a skill, which does make dealing with waves of them infinitely easier. Unfortunately, aside from such niche scenarios where you can avoid enemy attacks by being slightly higher, there aren't actually that many combat situations where this can be useful, especially since ascending into the air consumes so much flight stamina, which can limit your DPS. The biggest problem with the skill is that it has zero super armor, and Wanderer's staggerability is very high. Getting hit by a tiny helical arrow will cause Wanderer to get staggered and his recovery animation is really long. He can also get staggered more than once in quick succession, which is very annoying. This means that unless you have some immaculate dodging skills, you'll want some form of super armor with shielders like Zhongli, or other external sources such as Xingqiu's water swords or Deia's field. However, running a defensive option like that will obviously limit your damage potential, which is why I often don't run him with one, but it does make playing him very frustrating. No matter how good you are at dodging, you are inevitably going to get hit, and it's going to feel very bad when you do. This skill has a 6-second cooldown that starts after Wanderer stops flying, and you can cancel his flight at any given time by tapping E again while he is in the air if you want to preemptively fall to the ground. Also, while leveling this talent will increase his normal and charge attack damage, the scaling is lower than his actual normal attack talent, so you should prioritize this talent before his skill talent. Finally, moving on to his elemental burst. When casting, Wanderer will do a big wind vacuum that does 5 hits of AoE animal damage. The AoE is actually quite big, but the actual scaling of this burst is not super high, with a 1177.6% damage multiplier at talent level 8. If you cast this burst when Wanderer is in flight, he will drop to the ground immediately, which means that you should cast this burst either at the start of his field time or at the end if you want to maximize damage. However, if you have Wanderer at Constellation 2 or use the Shimenawa's Reminiscence artifact set, you are going to only want to burst at the end due to these being more restrictive for DPS. This burst is worth leveling, but unless you are at Constellation 2, the damage isn't particularly great, so it should generally be the lowest priority to level. This burst also has an average energy cost of 60, though due to his poor energy generation, you likely won't be able to cast this very often or enough to be of significant enough damage anyway. Onto his passive talents. His A1 is kind of interesting. When casting Wanderer's skill, if there are any swallowable elements nearby that come in contact with his AoE, he'll receive buffs depending on which element it was for the entirety of his flight time. The buffs are all listed here, and you can receive up to a maximum of 2 buffs per time. You can tell which element you infuse with the element indicators on his jet booster looking thingies on his back. The effects are all generally quite good, and you can just treat them as free buffs depending on the team comps you play. His A4 gives him additional damage during his flight. As stated here, hitting enemies with normal and charge attacks will give a set chance of activating this effect, with the chances increasing for each attack that does not proc. Once procced, Wanderer's jetpack will flash to indicate that it is active, and your next air dash will not consume stamina, while also firing off 5 little bolts that home in on enemies and deal animal damage. These bolts are treated as regular attacks with a 35% damage multiplier each and can crit. While this does seem like it incentivizes you to dash to fire the bolts, the damage multiplier isn't that high, and so in most setups, you'll only still dash if you need repositioning or dodging. And you can just treat the bolts as bonus damage to make up for some of the DPS loss needed to dodge. Now, unfortunately, catalysts in this game are what I would consider to be the worst category of weapons, especially in regards to the DPS options. So Wanderer isn't exactly spoiled for choice in this department. His obvious best in slot is going to be his signature weapon, the Tuletula's Remembrance. This weapon buffs both his attack speed and normal attacks, with the latter going up to a maximum of 48% bonus damage at Refinement 1. With this weapon, you're going to want to spam normal attacks rather than charge attacks due to the significant buff that this weapon provides. This weapon also has the highest base attack with crit damage as a substat, making it easier to balance stats around. From here on out, I'm going to move over to my main account since it has more catalysts that I can show. Alright, now that I'm on my main account, his next best weapon is going to be the Lost Prayer to the Sacred Winds. While this weapon sucks in general, it's actually usable on Wanderer due to his long field time. However, you almost certainly will never get the full buff from this weapon due to it needing him to remain on the field for over 16 seconds. So usually, you can consider to only have around 1 to 2 stacks of this weapon. With this weapon, you'll also likely prefer to burst at the end of his flight time to maximize the damage bonus. His other 5-star weapons are usable but not ideal. I'd say the next best thing would be Kagura's Verity just as a pure stat stick, and then Skyward Atlas or Memory of Dust are usable if you're playing in teams without Bennett. But these weapons are just not very good overall. Moving on to the 4-star options, the most obvious choice is the Witsith. It has crit as a substat with 2 out of the 3 buffs being significant damage boosts. Unfortunately, the EM buff is relatively useless in most teams, and as usual, its biggest problem is its absurdly long 20-second downtime, which makes this a bit of an inconsistent weapon to play for damage. Where the Witsith is an inconsistent weapon, the Solar Pearl is a much more consistent option. It also has crit as a substat with a decent passive that is overall useful to his kit. Unfortunately, this weapon is a paid option from the Battle Pass and also expensive to refine. Next up, I don't have this weapon as I was not playing Genshin when it was released, but the Dodoko Tails is actually a decent choice, though it being an attack percent weapon does make it scale slightly worse with team buffs. With this weapon, you will want to weave in normal and charge attacks at intervals for the weapon's buff. Unfortunately, that's it for my recommendations. DPS catalysts just kinda suck in this game, and there aren't very many good options in both the 4 and 5-star departments. Aside from his signature weapon, the rest of them perform relatively similarly to each other, so if you have any of the ones on the list, just use whichever one you want. Moving on to artifact stats. It's pretty straightforward for Wanderer since he is a very normal Hypercarry DPS archetype. The most obvious stats to target are your crit stats. As per normal, you should have over 70% crit rate, and because Wanderer ascends with crit, you should be able to achieve around 150 to 160% crit damage without a crit weapon. This amounts to roughly 200 crit value in artifacts alone, and if you are using a crit weapon, you can just add the crit value to the crit damage as your target stats. For how much energy recharge you need, unfortunately, due to Wanderer's poor energy generation, you are going to need a lot of ER to be able to cast his burst every rotation. As such, I recommend putting ER as a low priority and focus on your crit stats first. Once you are happy with your crit stats, then work your way to building enough ER to at least being able to burst every other rotation. If you have C6 Farazan, then it's going to be relatively easy to do so. If you have Wanderer at least at Constellation 2, then you might be more incentivized to burst every rotation and try to build more ER. Usually with at least around 130%, assuming you play with C6 Farazan and not with Shiminawa's Reminiscence. On to recommended sets. The best in slot is obviously going to be Desert Pavilion Chronicle. This set was tailor-made for Wanderer's kit, and with this set, you're going to want to open with 1 charge attack before spamming normal attacks to capitalize on its 4-piece bonus. However, this set is incredibly inefficient to farm. Because of this, the next set I recommend to most people is going to be the 4-piece Shiminawa's Reminiscence. This set is one that many people are going to have due to Emblem, and its DPS output is very similar to DPC. However, the biggest con of this set is that you cannot burst at the start of the rotation due to needing to get the energy drain to get the damage buff. This set also drives Wanderer's ER requirements up by a large amount and makes it nearly impossible to burst every rotation. Having this set also makes it harder to play Wanderer in the overworld since every time you want to fly, you're going to expend energy, and is the main reason why I personally don't like running this set on my free-to-play account where I use him as an overworld character almost every day. Because of the restrictions of 4-piece Shiminawas, I run 2-piece sets on my free-to-play Wanderer. While the damage is lower, it allows for more flexible rotations and has lower ER requirements. Being 2-piece combinations also makes it easier to build around. You can use combinations of the animal sets like the Viridescent Venera set or DPC, and other attack sets like Shiminawa's Reminiscence or Gladiator's Finale work as well. Alright, moving on to teams. Wanderer is actually decently flexible due to him being Anemo and being a normal attack based character. First up, I want to talk about the obvious, which are his Hypercarry teams. You're obviously going to want Farazan, preferably a C6 one, as one of the teammates, and your other teammate is almost always going to be Bennett. For those of you who are interested in how to build Faruzan, please watch my recently uploaded Faruzan guide if you haven't yet. As for who your last slot should be, I'd say the best offensive option is likely going to be Ji-Eun, who is going to buff both his normal attack speed and normal attack damage. But because Ji-Eun is a very low priority character to level, I'm going to assume that most people don't have her geared out, including myself. You can also alternatively use Zhongli or Layla as a defensive option, and other sub DPSs such as Xingqiu, Xiangling, or Yelan are all good too. One option I also like to mention that is not very common with Wanderer is actually Kazuha. Against certain domains or abyss chambers that have big AoE waves of enemies, a crowd controller is actually very good as an option to take a lot of the load off Wanderer due to his single target nature, while also providing more animal particles to burst more often. I don't often use them together, but there are definitely certain situations where they can be paired. Aside from hyper teams, you still have a lot of other teams that can work. National teams are going to work just fine as normal, and on my free-to-play account, I also often play him in a Hyperbloom comp as a driver. Generally, any elemental reaction-based teams that have characters who can remain off-field will work with Wanderer due to him needing field time to actually do damage. Even freeze teams are pretty good due to his charge attack AoE being quite decent, though running such a team will ideally want Kokomi since Mona's Hydra application is likely not going to cut it. The main teams that he won't work in are going to be Geo, Physical, and Dendro teams that aren't Bloom related. This is because he adds nothing of value to those teams and steals too much field time for those archetypes. Wanderer has some pretty good constellations, though I'd say none of them really fix his quality of life issues or gameplay style. Constellation 1. This increases his attack speed and slightly increases his A4 damage. Pretty straightforward, and if I remember correctly, this allows you to do 2 or 3 more normal attacks during flight, not including other buffs. It also makes it slightly more rewarding to dash in between your attacks. Constellation 2. This increases his burst damage with a 200% damage bonus multiplier if you cast it when you have less than half of your flight stamina. This makes it more worth it to use your burst and build slightly more energy recharge to burst every rotation, since the damage increase is actually surprisingly high. However, this also limits you to being able to burst at the end of your flight time, or you will not be able to get the buff from this constellation. Constellation 3 and Constellation 5 increases burst and skill talents by 3 levels respectively. Constellation 4. This grants 1 additional buff from his A1's elemental infusion independent of whatever you absorbed. For example, if you absorb Pyro and Hydro, then you will also be able to obtain either the Cryo or Electro buff. It's RNG so you can't pick, but it's nice to have since it's just a free buff to obtain. Constellation 6. This allows his normal attacks to fire additional arcs of animal damage with decent multipliers and is a pretty significant DPS boost. At the same time, his flight time is extended, though this also does increase his field time, which may or may not be more favorable to you. This is a pretty hefty DPS increase, usually by over 20%, but does limit you to mainly using normal attacks along with having a longer rotation. So in general, Wanderer has pretty decent constellations, though I'd say the only early one that's even worth going for is maybe Constellation 2. None of these constellations help him in terms of gameplay, and his playstyle doesn't change, so his issues such as lack of super armor still persist. These constellations merely serve as DPS increases, which is not a bad thing of course, it's just not anything special. Finally, onto the Abyss Showcase. I'll be using both of my Wanderers in different Abyss 12 chambers with both Hypercarry and Hyperbloom teams. Thanks for watching this Wanderer guide. I hope it was useful, and I wish everyone the best of luck building him. Do check out my Farazan guide if you haven't already, and my Twitch where I often stream Genshin Impact. Thanks once again for watching, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Take care.